The bride arrived at the wrong station, but the rancher's daughter cried, "Papa, heaven answered me." Sometimes the greatest blessings in life come from the most unexpected mistakes. Destiny has a peculiar way of leading us exactly where we need to be, even when it seems we've gone terribly astray. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The Kansas sun beat down mercilessly as Jonas McGraw stood on the weathered platform of the railway station, his calloused hands gripping his worn hat. The distant whistle of the approaching train pierced the prairie silence, bringing with it an unexpected twist of fate. Jonas had come merely to collect a package of supplies, not anticipating how this ordinary errand would upend his carefully ordered life. When the train finally shuddered to a halt, passengers began to disembark. Among them was a slender woman who stepped tentatively onto the platform, confusion evident in her searching gaze. Evelyn Carter clutched her trunk with white-knuckled determination, her travel-worn dress fluttering in the prairie wind. She approached the station master, her voice barely audible over the hissing steam of the locomotive. "I believe there's been a mistake," she said, producing a crumpled ticket. "I meant to be in Willow Creek, not—" Her voice trailed off as she glanced around the unfamiliar surroundings. The station master shook his head apologetically. "Ma'am, this is Cottonwood Springs. Willow Creek's another 20 miles west. Next train won't be through until Tuesday." Jonas observed the exchange from a distance, noting the woman's straight posture despite her evident distress. He might have simply tipped his hat and continued with his business, had it not been for the small hand tugging insistently at his sleeve. "Papa, look!" 8-year-old Abigail McGraw's eyes shone with an almost feverish excitement. Her voice dropped to a reverent whisper. "Heaven answered me!" The rancher looked down at his daughter in bewilderment. "What are you talking about, child?" "My prayers—" Abigail's face was alight with conviction. "Every night I asked for a new mama, and now she's here." Jonas felt a familiar ache in his chest. Since his wife's passing 3 years ago, Abigail's longing for a mother had been as constant as the prairie wind. He'd heard her whispered prayers through her bedroom door more times than he could count. "Abigail, that's just a stranger who's lost her way," he murmured, but his daughter was already rushing toward the bewildered woman. "Hello, I'm Abigail McGraw," she announced, extending her small hand with surprising formality. "Are you looking for somewhere to stay?" Evelyn's startled expression softened as she knelt to the child's level. "I am, actually. Just until the next train." Before Jonas could intervene, his daughter had already taken the stranger's free hand. "You can stay with us, can't she, Papa?" Jonas found himself caught between his natural caution and the hope blazing in his daughter's eyes. With a reluctant nod, he approached the pair. "Jonas McGraw," he introduced himself simply. "Our ranch is 5 miles east. You're welcome until Tuesday's train, Miss—" "Carter. Evelyn Carter," she replied, relief washing over her features. "I'm most grateful, Mr. McGraw." As they loaded her trunk into the wagon, Jonas couldn't shake the feeling that this mistaken arrival might be more consequential than any of them realized. Evelyn Carter stepped over the threshold of the McGraw home, her gloved hand clutching her small travel bag. The wooden floorboards creaked beneath her feet, announcing her presence to the silent house. Dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight that streamed through the windows, illuminating a home that felt both lived in and abandoned. "It's not much," Jonas mumbled, his tall frame awkwardly shifting as he watched her take in her surroundings. "My wife kept it better." The rancher's words hung in the air, and Evelyn felt the weight of an absent woman's presence. Photographs on the mantel showed a smiling face, now just a memory haunting these walls. She nodded silently, understanding that she was an intruder in this space of grief. "Your room is upstairs," Abigail announced, tugging at Evelyn's hand with childish excitement. "I put flowers by the window." The first night, Evelyn lay awake listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the prairie, coyotes in the distance, the occasional lowing of cattle, the house settling like a tired old man. By morning, she was determined to earn her keep, however temporary her stay might be. Breakfast proved disastrous. The bread burned black in the unfamiliar stove, filling the kitchen with acrid smoke. Jonas said nothing, simply scraping the charred remains into the slop bucket before heading out to the barn. His silence felt heavier than any criticism. "Mama's recipe book is in the drawer," Abigail offered helpfully after he'd gone. "I can show you the pages with the corners turned down. Those were Papa's favorites. Days passed in a blur of small failures. Evelyn's Eastern upbringing had prepared her for teaching arithmetic and literature. not for the practical demands of ranch life. She dropped eggs, oversalted stew, and once nearly set her skirt ablaze while tending the cookstove. Yet Abigail's unwavering faith never dimmed. The child followed her like a shadow, chattering about school and horses and showing her treasured dolls. "You braid hair better than Papa," she declared one evening as Eveline's fingers worked through her tangled locks. Jonas kept his distance, but Eveline often caught him watching her from across the room or through the window as she struggled with the water pump. His gaze wasn't unkind, just wary, like a man afraid to hope. On the 5th day, when Eveline successfully baked a passable loaf of bread, she caught the faintest hint of approval in his nod. That small gesture felt like winning a hard-fought battle. "I reckon you can stay until the next train comes through," he said that evening, not meeting her eyes. No sense rushing off with nowhere proper to go. Eveline nodded, surprised by the small spark of relief she felt. This wasn't home, not by any measure, but something about Abigail's smile and even Jonas's gruff courtesy made her willing to stay, at least for now. The Kansas summer beat down mercilessly upon the McGraw Ranch, turning the vast prairie into a shimmering sea of golden grass. Eveline Carter wiped sweat from her brow as she struggled with the heavy cast-iron skillet. Her third attempt at biscuits that morning had yielded yet another batch of charred, inedible lumps. She stared at her hands, once smooth and suited for pointing at chalkboards, now red and blistered from wrestling with ranch chores. "You'll get the hang of it," Abigail offered cheerfully, sweeping the burnt offerings into the waste bin. The child's unwavering faith was both comforting and daunting. Eveline nodded, determined not to let her frustration show. The school teacher had never imagined herself here, learning to cook on a temperamental wood stove when she should have been organizing lesson plans in a neighboring town. Yet something about this place, this accidental home, made her want to persevere. That afternoon, seeking refuge from the kitchen failures, she wandered into the barn. The rich scent of hay and leather enveloped her as her eyes adjusted to the dim light. A pile of damaged tack lay discarded in the corner, bridles with broken straps, and saddles with loose stitching. Without thinking, she picked up a needle and thread from the workbench and settled onto a hay bale. Jonas McGraw found her there an hour later, head bent in concentration as her fingers worked deftly at mending a bridle. He paused in the doorway, watching silently. The rancher had expected to find her defeated by now, ready to continue her journey elsewhere. Instead, she was adapting, finding ways to contribute despite her obvious discomfort. "My father owned a stable back east," Eveline explained without looking up, somehow sensing his presence. "I used to mend tack while waiting for him after school." Jonas nodded, his usual stoicism hiding his surprise. "That bridle belongs to Thunder," he said, referring to his most temperamental stallion. "I noticed the break when you rode in yesterday," she replied, tying off a neat stitch. "Dangerous, riding with damaged equipment." Outside, cattle lowed in the distance as the evening approached. The ranch hand called out commands to the herd, his voice carrying across the property. Eveline handed the repaired bridle to Jonas, their fingers briefly touching. "Tomorrow I'll show you how to make a proper stew," he offered gruffly, the closest thing to approval he had shown since her arrival. Eveline smiled, a small victory in her campaign to belong. As she walked back toward the house with Jonas, Abigail ran to meet them, her pigtails bouncing with each step. The girl slipped her small hand into Eveline's blistered one, creating a tenuous connection between the three of them. Not quite a family, but no longer merely strangers thrown together by circumstance. The early autumn brought with it the necessity of the cattle drive, a ritual Jonas McGraw had performed every year since inheriting the ranch from his father. This time, however, would be different. Jonas decided that Eveline and Abigail should accompany him to market, partly to show them the harsh realities of ranch life, and partly because something in him wanted them to understand this essential part of his world. "We leave at dawn," he announced over supper, his weathered hands gripping his coffee mug. "Pack only what you need. The journey is 3 days each way." Eveline nodded, determination flashing in her eyes. Though she had never ridden more than a few hours at a stretch, she refused to show hesitation. The schoolteacher in her recognized this as the education she needed most. The first day tested them all. Dust clouds billowed across the endless prairie, coating their clothes, their skin, their very thoughts in a fine layer of grit. Abigail rode beside her father, her small frame bouncing with each step of her pony, while Eveline struggled to maintain control of her mount at the rear of the herd. "Keep them moving toward that ridge," Jonas called over his shoulder, his voice nearly lost in the lowing of cattle and the whistle of prairie wind. By midday, Eveline's thighs burned with unfamiliar exertion and her hands were raw from gripping the reins, yet she said nothing, even when the rancher glanced back with what she thought might be concern in his eyes. That night, as they camped beneath a vast canopy of stars, Abigail fell asleep almost instantly, exhausted but exhilarated. Jonas found Eveline by the fire, silently massaging her blistered palms. "Tomorrow will be worse," he said, offering her a tin of salve. "The crossing at Miller's Creek is always troublesome." His prediction proved accurate. A sudden squall turned the creek crossing into chaos. When 3 calves broke from the herd, panicked by thunder, Eveline didn't hesitate. She spurred her horse forward, circling wide to cut them off before they scattered into the wilderness. Jonas watched, momentarily frozen, as she guided the frightened animals back to safety, her soaked clothing clinging to her frame, her face set with fierce concentration. That evening he wordlessly handed her the first plate of beans from the cook fire, a small gesture that spoke volumes to the ranch hands who exchanged knowing glances. By the time they reached the market town on the 3rd day, Eveline's fair skin was wind-burned, and her eastern mannerisms had given way to a quiet frontier practicality. She helped negotiate with the cattle buyers, her quick mind catching a discrepancy in the count that would have cost them dearly. On the journey home, Jonas rode beside her for a stretch, breaking his customary silence. "You've got grit," he said simply, the highest compliment he knew how to give. Abigail beamed at Eveline from atop her pony. "Mama would have been proud of you," she whispered later, words that settled into Eveline's heart like seeds in fertile soil. The fiddle's lively tune filled the saloon as Eveline Carter stepped through the swinging doors, her borrowed dress slightly too large at the shoulders. Jonas McGraw and Abigail followed behind her, the child bouncing with excitement at her first town gathering. The wooden floorboards vibrated with stomping boots and swirling skirts, but the moment Eveline entered, several conversations hushed. "That's her, the woman staying at the McGraw place," whispered a woman in a blue bonnet, not bothering to lower her voice enough. "Just showed up on the train one day." Imagine that. Eveline felt her cheeks burn as she moved toward the refreshment table. The rancher nodded to several men before being pulled into conversation about cattle prices, while Abigail quickly found other children playing near the back door. Left alone, she poured herself a cup of punch, feeling the weight of stares against her back. "Mrs. Holloway makes the best punch in the county," offered an elderly man with kind eyes. "Been the same recipe since before the war." She smiled gratefully at this small kindness, but when she turned, 3 women abruptly scattered from their huddle. Their whispers followed her, speculation about her intentions, her past, her relationship with Jonas. One particularly cutting comment about desperate women chasing widowers made her fingers tighten around her cup. The schoolteacher approached, offering a sympathetic smile. "Don't mind them. New faces are rare currency in gossip-starved towns." "I'm beginning to understand that," Eveline replied, watching couples twirl across the floor. When Jonas awkwardly asked her to dance, more for propriety than pleasure, she accepted despite knowing it would only fuel speculation. His hand rested stiffly at her waist as they moved in measured steps. "You don't have to do this," she murmured. "Abigail insisted," he answered, his eyes fixed somewhere over her shoulder. Later, seated on a bench while watching Abigail play, Eveline overheard the saloon owner's wife. "She seems decent enough, but who knows where she came from? A proper woman doesn't just arrive unannounced." Something hardened in Eveline's chest, not shame, but resolve. These people knew nothing of her teaching aspirations or the circumstances that had brought her here. Their approval couldn't be demanded or begged for. It would have to be earned through time and consistent character. As the evening drew to a close, Abigail fell asleep against her shoulder. Jonas gathered his daughter into his arms, and Eveline followed them to the wagon. The night air felt clean after the stuffy saloon, the stars offering silent witness to her determination. "I belong somewhere," she thought, climbing onto the wooden seat. "Perhaps not here yet, but someday." The dust cloud appeared on the horizon well before the black carriage came into view. Jonas McGraw stood on his porch, one hand resting on the weathered railing, the other shading his eyes from the harsh midday sun. He recognized the railroad company insignia painted on the side of the approaching vehicle. "They're back," he muttered to himself, jaw tightening. Eveline emerged from the house, wiping her hands on her apron. "Who is it?" she asked, squinting toward the approaching visitors. "Railroad men," the rancher replied, his voice carrying the weight of generations who had fought to keep their land. "Coming to take what isn't theirs." The carriage pulled up to the ranch house, and a well-dressed man stepped down, removing his hat. "Mr. McGraw," he called with practiced cordiality. "Thomas Whitfield, Central Kansas Railroad? I believe we spoke last season about our expansion plans. Jonas nodded curtly. I remember. My answer hasn't changed. Whitfield smiled, undeterred. The offer has improved considerably. We're prepared to pay 20% more than market value for that eastern section of your property. Eveline watched the exchange with quiet fascination. While Jonas stood rigid with suspicion, she found herself wondering what the railroad might bring. Mail delivered more frequently, supplies from back east, perhaps even visitors and new ideas. That land has been in my family for 2 generations, Jonas said firmly. It's not for sale at any price. The foreman unrolled a map across the hood of his carriage. Progress is coming whether we want it or not, Mr. McGraw. The line will connect Kansas City to Denver, bringing prosperity to everyone along its path. Eveline stepped forward, her curiosity overcoming her hesitation. How soon would construction begin? She asked. Jonas shot her a look of betrayal, but she held her ground. Within 6 months, ma'am, Whitfield replied, tipping his hat to her. Towns with rail access are seeing their economies double, even triple. We're doing fine without your progress, Jonas interrupted. My cattle need that grazing land. Later, after the railroad men had departed with promises to return, tension hung in the kitchen, like morning fog. Abigail sat quietly at the table, sensing the unspoken conflict between the adults. You seemed quite taken with their plans, Jonas finally said, his voice carefully measured. Eveline placed a cup of coffee before him. I only asked questions, she replied softly. Where I come from, the railroad brought opportunities, especially for children like Abigail. And it took things too, he countered. Land, independence, the old ways. Their eyes met across the table, and in that moment they recognized something fundamental about each other. Jonas, holding tight to what he knew, feared change would only bring more loss. Eveline, having already lost her planned future, saw possibility in the unknown. The railroad's shadow stretched across more than just the McGraw land. It fell between them, highlighting the different paths they still might choose. Winter arrived with a vengeance on the McGraw ranch, bringing bitter winds that rattled the windows and froze the water troughs. The change of season might have passed like any other, if not for the morning Jonas McGraw found his daughter burning with fever, her small body shivering beneath 3 quilts. Something's wrong with Abigail, he said, his voice cracking as Eveline rushed to the child's bedside. The girl's normally rosy cheeks had turned ashen, her breathing shallow and labored. Eveline placed a cool cloth on the child's forehead. We need to bring this fever down, she whispered, already rolling up her sleeves. The next 48 hours became a blur of wet compresses, spoonfuls of broth, and whispered prayers. Jonas paced the floorboards, his face etched with a fear deeper than any Eveline had witnessed before. I can't lose her too, he confessed during the second night, his voice barely audible over the howling wind. The rancher's admission hung between them, the first crack in his carefully maintained facade. They worked in tandem, spelling each other for brief moments of rest. When Jonas dozed in the chair beside Abigail's bed, Eveline noticed how his large, calloused hand never left his daughter's small one. During her own brief respites, she would return to find him whispering stories of cattle drives and spring flowers, promises of adventures when she recovered. On the 3rd day, when the doctor from town shook his head gravely and mentioned preparing for the worst, something sparked in Eveline's memory. Wait, she said, grabbing her shawl. There's something I need to try. She trudged through knee-deep snow to the edge of the property where she'd noticed wild herbs growing months before. Her fingers, numb with cold, broke through ice to gather what remained beneath. Back in the kitchen, she brewed a bitter-smelling tea, knowledge passed down from her grandmother surfacing when they needed it most. It might taste awful, she warned as Jonas helped prop Abigail up, but it will help. By morning, the fever had broken. Abigail's eyes fluttered open, clear for the first time in days. You stayed, she murmured to Eveline, her small hand reaching out. Jonas stood in the doorway, watching. The relief on his face slowly transformed into something else, recognition. In these desperate hours, Eveline had become more than a mistaken guest or temporary helper. She had fought for his child, as fiercely as he had. That evening, after Abigail had fallen into a healing sleep, Jonas found Eveline in the kitchen. Without words, he placed a cup of coffee before her, then sat across the table. They remained in comfortable silence, the barrier between them forever altered by shared vigil and salvation. The first signs of spring brought more than just melting snow to the McGraw ranch. As the frost retreated from the Kansas soil, A dark figure appeared on the horizon, riding purposefully toward the homestead. Thomas Blackwell, a banker from the neighboring town of Millbrook, arrived with his chin held high and purpose in his stride. He was Evelyn Carter's original intended, the man whose proposal had brought her west in the first place. Jonas McGraw watched from the porch, his weathered hands gripping the railing as the stranger dismounted. Something cold settled in his chest when the visitor announced himself and his business. The rancher had grown accustomed to Evelyn's presence in his home, her gentle ways with Abigail, her determined efforts to learn ranch life. Now this man threatened everything. "Miss Carter belongs with me," Thomas declared over supper, his voice carrying the confidence of contracts and arrangements. "Our agreement was made months ago." Evelyn sat quietly, her fingers twisting the fabric of her skirt beneath the table. The life she had planned, security with a respectable man in a proper town, now felt foreign compared to the authentic existence she'd found at the ranch. Yet duty weighed heavily on her shoulders. "Will you leave us?" Abigail whispered that night as Evelyn tucked her into bed. The child's eyes brimmed with tears, her prayers no longer the peaceful nighttime ritual, but desperate pleas to heaven. "I don't know, sweet one," Evelyn answered honestly, her heart torn between obligation and the unexpected affection that had bloomed in this unlikely place. Jonas avoided the house during Thomas's 3-day visit, finding endless tasks in the barn and fields. But each time he glimpsed Evelyn walking with her suitor, discussing their future with serious expressions. Something fierce and protective rose within him. These feelings, ones he had buried alongside his wife, terrified him more than any prairie storm. On the third evening, Jonas found Evelyn alone by the corral, watching the sunset paint the prairie gold. Without looking at him, she spoke softly. "He wants an answer by morning." The rancher removed his hat, turning it in his hands. "What will you tell him?" "I made a promise," she replied, her voice catching. "But nothing is as I expected when I stepped off that train." As darkness fell across the land, 3 souls lay awake in the McGraw home. A child praying for a mother, a woman torn between duty and desire, and a man finally facing the truth that his heart had begun to heal despite his best efforts to keep it locked away. Miss Harriet Wells arrived at the McGraw ranch on a crisp autumn morning, her wagon kicking up dust along the well-worn path. The local schoolteacher's eyes lit up when she spotted Evelyn Carter in the yard, hanging laundry with practiced efficiency that belied her relatively short time on the ranch. "Those reading lessons you organized have been a godsend," Harriet exclaimed, clasping Evelyn's hands in her own. "The Thornton children can finally recite their letters, and little Samuel Jenkins is devouring books faster than I can supply them." Evelyn smiled, a flush of pride warming her cheeks. What had begun as simple afternoon sessions teaching neighboring children to read had blossomed into something meaningful. Jonas watched from the barn doorway, his expression softening as he observed the animated conversation between the women. "The town council meeting was quite something yesterday," the schoolteacher continued, lowering her voice. "Mrs. Peterson, you know, the one who spread those awful rumors about you, actually defended your character when the subject of the reading lessons came up." This news startled Evelyn. The memory of cold glances and whispered gossip at the dance still stung. "Truly? I can hardly believe it." "Your actions speak volumes," Harriet insisted. "These families have seen what you've done for their children. That matters more than any gossip." Later that evening, as Abigail helped set the table for supper, she beamed at Evelyn. "Miss Wells says you could be a real teacher here someday. Will you stay and be our teacher, Evelyn?" The innocent question hung in the air. Jonas paused, his hand gripping the back of his chair, eyes carefully avoiding Evelyn's. Evelyn began, suddenly aware of the weight of her words. Her intended destination, her original future, seemed increasingly distant with each passing day. Yet her family's expectations pulled at her conscience like an invisible thread. That night, unable to sleep, Evelyn sat by the window, watching moonlight bathe the prairie in silver. The ranch had ceased being merely shelter and had somehow become home. The thought of leaving Abigail's eager face, the children who waited for their lessons, and Jonas's quiet, steady presence created an ache she hadn't anticipated. A letter from her family back east sat unopened on her bedside table. Each step toward belonging here pushed her further from the life she had planned. The schoolteacher's support had opened doors in town, offering a glimpse of a future she hadn't dared imagine. Evelyn traced patterns on the windowpane, her reflection staring back at her with questions she wasn't ready to answer. The respect she'd earned came with a price, the heavier burden of choice. Abigail's tiny hands tugged at the heavy oak chest, determination etched across her face. "Miss Eveline, may I borrow your blue dress for my doll?" The question hung in the air as Eveline Carter hesitated, then nodded with a gentle smile. Jonas McGraw watched from the doorway, arms folded across his chest, as his daughter eagerly lifted the trunk's heavy lid. What they discovered beneath the neatly folded garments left them speechless. Stacks of primers, arithmetic books, geography texts, and carefully penned lesson plans lay bundled with colorful paper cutouts and hand-drawn maps. Abigail's eyes widened as she pulled out a wooden pointer and a small brass bell. "You're a teacher," Jonas said, his voice somewhere between accusation and wonder. The revelation hung in the air between them, reshaping everything they thought they knew about the woman who had accidentally entered their lives. Eveline's cheeks flushed as she gathered the materials with trembling hands. "I was to be the school teacher in Oak Ridge," she admitted. "The position was arranged through correspondence, but somehow—" Her voice trailed off as she remembered the confusion at the station, the wrong stop, the twist of fate that had brought her here instead. "Why didn't you tell us?" Jonas asked, his brow furrowed. The rancher's weathered face revealed little, but his eyes betrayed his confusion. "At first, I was simply trying to find my way." Then, as days passed, she looked at Abigail, who was now reverently turning the pages of a primer. "I feared you might see me differently." Abigail looked up from the book, her expression serious beyond her years. "Could you teach me more than Mrs. Holloway does at the schoolhouse? She never lets us read poetry." The tension in the room softened as Eveline knelt beside the child. "I have volumes of poetry. Would you like to hear some?" That evening, the usual silence of the McGraw home was replaced by Eveline's clear voice, reciting Wordsworth beneath the golden glow of the lantern. Jonas, pretending to review cattle records, found himself listening intently, memories of his own abbreviated schooling surfacing like forgotten treasures. Later, with Abigail asleep, he approached Eveline on the porch. "I never finished school," he confessed, staring out at the darkened prairie. "Always meant to learn more, but the ranch—" "Dreams deferred," she murmured, understanding in her eyes. "Perhaps," Jonas replied, his voice softer than usual. "It's not too late for some dreams." He didn't specify which ones, but as they stood side by side in the cool evening air, something new took root between them, a shared understanding built on revealed truths and unexpected common ground. Caleb Thornton had worked for the McGraw Ranch longer than anyone else. The ranch hand's weathered face had seen Jonas through the worst days after his wife's passing, and he prided himself on his loyalty. But as he watched Eveline Carter move about the property with increasing confidence, something dark twisted in his gut. "She ain't gonna stay, you know," Caleb said one evening, cornering Eveline by the barn as she finished hanging the laundry. "The boss never got over his wife. You're just filling time until you realize it." Eveline's hand stilled on the damp fabric. The ranch hand's words cut deeper than she wanted to admit. "Jonas has been nothing but kind to me," she replied, keeping her voice steady. "Kind?" Caleb scoffed. "He's kind to his horse, too." "Don't mean he'll marry it." In the days that followed, small things began to go wrong around the ranch. A broken fence that Jonas had asked to be repaired remained damaged, allowing 3 calves to wander dangerously close to the ravine. The wagon wheel that Caleb claimed to have fixed came loose during a supply run, nearly causing Eveline and Abigail to overturn on their way back from town. "Strange how things keep breaking," Jonas muttered one evening, examining the snapped leather of a bridle that had been recently mended. Eveline watched his face carefully. "Perhaps someone doesn't want things to work properly," she suggested, her voice barely above a whisper. Jonas looked up sharply. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that loyalty can sometimes mask other feelings." She hesitated. "Caleb told me you'd never open your heart again, that I shouldn't get comfortable here." A muscle tightened in Jonas's jaw. "Caleb said that to you?" That night, Eveline lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Had she made a mistake in telling Jonas? Would he believe his longtime worker over her? The thought of leaving the ranch, leaving Abigail, made her chest ache with a pain she hadn't expected. The next morning, Jonas was unusually quiet at breakfast. Abigail chattered happily, oblivious to the tension, while Eveline's stomach twisted with anxiety. When Jonas finally spoke, his voice was low but clear. "I've asked Caleb to move on." Eveline's spoon clattered against her bowl. "You did what? A man who undermines my family undermines me," Jonas said simply. "I won't have it." family. The word hung in the air between them. Was that what they had become? Eveline felt hope flutter in her chest, fragile as a prairie butterfly. "But he's been with you for years," she said softly. Jonas McGraw looked at her directly then, his eyes holding hers. Some loyalties need to be questioned, and some walls need to come down. Abigail McGraw's small hands trembled as she sealed the envelope. For weeks, she had been working on this letter in secret, carefully forming each letter by lamplight after her father and Eveline had gone to bed. The child had poured her heart onto the paper, begging Reverend Thomas to help make Eveline her new mother. She slipped the letter to the mail carrier during his next visit to the ranch, her heart full of hope and certainty that God would answer her prayers. 3 days later, Jonas was repairing a fence when he spotted a familiar black buggy approaching down the dusty road. His brow furrowed as he recognized Reverend Thomas, the local preacher whose visits typically coincided with Sundays or tragedy. This unexpected appearance in the middle of the week left the rancher uneasy. "Afternoon, Jonas," the Reverend called, climbing down from his buggy. "Might I have a word?" Inside the house, Eveline was teaching Abigail arithmetic when they heard the men's voices approaching. The little girl's eyes widened with recognition, and a smile spread across her face. "I received a most heartfelt letter," Reverend Thomas explained, accepting a cup of coffee from Eveline. He pulled a carefully folded paper from his pocket. "From young Abigail here?" Jonas turned to his daughter, confusion evident in his weathered face. "What letter?" The preacher's gentle voice filled the room as he read Abigail's words aloud, her prayers for a mother, her belief that God had sent Eveline to them, and her plea for help in convincing her father to see what she saw so clearly. "Papa, I just wanted heaven to know I'm grateful," Abigail whispered, her eyes downcast but determined. Eveline stood frozen by the stove, her cheeks flushed with emotion. The schoolteacher in her admired the child's penmanship. The woman in her was overwhelmed by the depth of Abigail's attachment. "Jonas," the Reverend said softly, "sometimes the Lord works in ways we don't expect. This child has faith enough to move mountains, but she shouldn't have to move her father's heart alone." The rancher's jaw tightened as he felt 3 pairs of eyes upon him. The walls of the home seemed to close in, forcing him to confront feelings he'd buried beneath layers of duty and routine. "I'll leave you to consider," Reverend Thomas said, placing a hand on Jonas's shoulder. "But remember, silence can cost more than words ever will." After the preacher departed, Jonas McGraw stood at the window, watching dust settle on the road. Behind him, Eveline quietly resumed the arithmetic lesson, but the equations on the slate were blurred by the tears in Abigail's eyes. In that moment, Jonas realized that his silence wasn't protecting anyone, least of all himself. The time for decisions had arrived, carried on the wings of a child's prayer. The first scream of warning came from the eastern ridge. Jonas McGraw dropped his tools and ran to the porch, his heart pounding as he saw it. A wall of orange and black, consuming the prairie with terrifying speed. The fire had started miles away, but the dry summer grass fed its hunger, turning it into a roaring beast racing toward everything he owned. "Eveline! Abigail!" he shouted, voice cracking with urgency. Within moments, Eveline Carter appeared at his side, her face paling at the sight. She squeezed his arm once before springing into action. "I'll get Abigail to safety." "You warn the hands." The ranch erupted into organized chaos. Neighbors on horseback appeared through the thickening smoke, having spotted the danger from their own properties. Jonas directed men to dig fire breaks while others soaked the buildings with precious water from the well. But it was the cattle that worried him most, 300 head trapped in the south pasture, directly in the fire's path. "They'll stampede into it if we don't move them!" Jonas shouted over the roar of approaching flames. To his astonishment, Eveline appeared on horseback, her skirts hitched up and tied at her waist, a bandana covering her nose and mouth. "Abigail's with the schoolteacher. I can help." Before he could protest, she spurred her mount toward the pasture. Jonas had no choice but to follow, watching in disbelief as this woman who'd arrived by mistake less than a year ago fearlessly guided his panicking herd toward the creek bed. "Keep them moving northwest," she called to the ranch hands, her voice steady despite the chaos. The cattle, wild-eyed with fear, followed her lead as smoke stung their eyes and ash rained down upon them, hours blurred together in heat and exhaustion. When the wind finally shifted, granting them mercy, Jonas found Eveline slumped against a fence post, face streaked with soot, hands raw and bleeding from rope burns. "We lost the south grazing land," she murmured, "but the herd is safe." Jonas knelt beside her, offering his canteen. How did you know to do that? To lead them along the creek? My father raised horses back east, she admitted. Fire's the same enemy, no matter where you are. That night, as the embers cooled on the blackened prairie, Jonas watched Eveline gently tend to Abigail's fears with stories and quiet reassurance. The child clung to her, no longer seeing a stranger but someone who belonged. You saved us today, Jonas said later when Abigail had finally fallen asleep. Eveline looked up, surprised by the emotion in his voice. This is my home, too, she said simply. And in that moment they both knew it was true. Not by accident, not by arrangement, but by choice and courage. Eveline had claimed her place on the McGraw ranch. The gentle Kansas spring light filtered through the kitchen window as Eveline Carter stood frozen, the letter from her family trembling slightly in her hands. She had been waiting months for this correspondence, checking with the station master weekly. Now that it had arrived, the familiar handwriting of her mother brought both comfort and unexpected dread. My dearest daughter, the letter began, your absence has left a void in our home that grows more unbearable with each passing day. Her family detailed their struggles without her, father's worsening cough, her younger sister's upcoming debut in society, the family business requiring additional hands. Every carefully penned word was a silken thread tugging her back east, back to the life she had planned before the railway mistake that brought her to the McGraw ranch. Eveline sank into a chair at the worn kitchen table, the same spot where she had shared countless meals with Jonas and Abigail over these unexpected months. The letter requested, no, implored, her immediate return, reminding her of obligations to aging parents and the teaching position that still awaited her. We have delayed informing the school board of your extended absence, her mother wrote, but cannot maintain this pretense much longer. Outside, she could hear Abigail's laughter as the child helped her father with the morning chores. The sound pierced Eveline's heart. When had that little girl's happiness become so precious to her? When had Jonas's rare, reluctant smiles become something she worked to earn each day? She folded the letter carefully, tucking it into her apron pocket as she moved to the doorway. From there, she watched father and daughter working together, their movements synchronized by years of shared life. Jonas looked up, catching her gaze. His nod of acknowledgement, once so formal, now warm with familiarity, made her chest tighten. The schoolteacher had mentioned just yesterday how the neighboring children had improved since Eveline began helping with their lessons. The ranch hands now tipped their hats respectfully when she brought water to the fields. Even the women at church had begun to include her in their conversations. Eveline pressed her palm against the letter in her pocket. Back east waited certainty, respectability, and the fulfillment of family expectations. Here on the prairie stood a life unplanned, but somehow more vivid. Difficult, yes, but rich with genuine connection. That night, as she penned a response to her family, Eveline's hand hesitated over the paper. Duty pulled in one direction, her heart in another. The decision before her was agonizing, measuring the weight of obligation against the unexpected gift of belonging she had found in this windswept corner of Kansas. The morning sun cast long shadows across the McGraw ranch as a commotion erupted from the barn. A high-pitched whinny, followed by crashes and the shouts of men, sent Jonas McGraw running from the house, his heart pounding with worry about what valuable equipment might be destroyed. Inside the dim barn, his prized stallion, a temperamental beast that had thrown 2 ranch hands last season, reared wildly, eyes rolling white with fear. The men stood back, helplessly watching as the animal threatened to injure itself against the wooden stalls. Before Jonas could intervene, Eveline Carter appeared at his side, her face calm despite the chaos. Without a word, she slipped past him and approached the frantic horse with measured steps. The ranch hands called warnings, but she moved with such quiet confidence that Jonas found himself speechless. "Easy now," she murmured, her voice dropping to a gentle hum that seemed to cut through the animal's panic. Her hands extended, palms down. She moved closer with a surety that suggested years of practice. The stallion's ears flicked toward her, its breathing still rapid, but its movements slowing. Within minutes, Eveline had the horse's halter in her hands, stroking its neck and whispering words too soft for anyone else to hear. The transformation was remarkable, the dangerous situation diffused by knowledge Jonas hadn't known she possessed. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked when the crisis had passed, unable to hide his astonishment. Eveline tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, suddenly self-conscious. "My father owned a livery stable back east," she admitted. I practically grew up in the stalls. I didn't mention it, because she hesitated. Well, it didn't seem like the sort of thing a proper schoolteacher or potential wife should boast about. Jonas studied her face, seeing not just the woman who had stumbled into their lives by accident, but someone with depths he'd never bothered to explore. "You've been hiding this skill all these months." She nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. "There are many things you don't know about me, Mr. McGraw." The revelation rippled through the ranch. By sundown, the story had spread among the workers, and Jonas noticed a shift in how they regarded Eveline, no longer as the misplaced outsider but as someone who understood their world, perhaps even better than they'd expected. That evening, as Abigail chattered excitedly about her mama's heroics, Jonas watched Eveline across the dinner table. How many other talents and stories lay beneath her quiet exterior? For the first time, he felt a genuine curiosity about the woman who had accidentally become part of their lives, and an unexpected eagerness to discover more. The crackling fire cast dancing shadows across the McGraw living room as Jonas McGraw whittled a small wooden horse, his weathered hands moving with practiced precision. Abigail sat cross-legged on the floor, arranging her collection of prairie wildflowers while Eveline mended a torn shirt by lamplight. When Abigail told a story about the neighbor's cat chasing its own tail, Eveline's laughter rang through the room, light and musical, filling every corner of the otherwise quiet house. Abigail looked up, her eyes wide with wonder. "You laugh just like Mama used to," she said innocently. "Papa always said Mama's laugh could make flowers grow." The knife in Jonas's hand stilled. His shoulders tensed, as if struck by physical pain. The comparison hung in the air, unexpected and piercing. For 3 years, he had carefully preserved his late wife's memory in silence, keeping her ghost between himself and any chance of moving forward. Eveline's eyes darted to Jonas, uncertain how to navigate this fragile moment. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though she had nothing to apologize for. "No need," Jonas managed, his voice rough as sandpaper. He set down his whittling and walked to the window, staring out at the darkened prairie. The rancher's broad shoulders seemed to bear the weight of both past and present. Abigail, sensing the shift in atmosphere, gathered her flowers and quietly excused herself to bed, kissing both adults goodnight with solemn tenderness beyond her years. When the child's footsteps faded, Eveline approached Jonas cautiously. "She meant no harm. I know." His voice was barely audible. "It's just—" He paused, searching for words that had been buried beneath years of stoic silence. "I never expected to hear that sound in this house again." "Your wife's laughter?" Jonas nodded, his profile sharp, against the window. "Elizabeth loved to laugh. The house was always full of it before." He couldn't finish. Eveline stood beside him, close enough to feel his warmth, but not touching. "Tell me about her," she said softly. For the first time since Elizabeth's death, Jonas spoke of his wife, not in practiced polite phrases offered to neighbors, but in real memories. How she sang while kneading bread, how she taught Abigail to name every star, how terrified he had been to love again. "I've been keeping her ghost between us," he admitted finally. "Between me and Abigail. Between me and—" His eyes met Eveline's. "I understand," she said. "Some ghosts need to be honored, not banished." That night, something shifted in the McGraw home. The past remained, cherished, but no longer a barrier. As Jonas walked Eveline to her door, his hand briefly touched hers, a small gesture that spoke of possibilities neither had dared acknowledge before. The evening air hung heavy with unspoken words as Eveline Carter sat on the porch steps, letter clutched in her trembling hands. Her original suitor, Mr. Blackwood, had given her until sunrise to accept his proposal, a respectable offer that would fulfill her family's expectations back east. The man stood tall and proper beside his wagon in the yard, his impatience visible in the tight set of his shoulders. "I understand your hesitation, Miss Carter," he said, his voice carrying across the yard. "But I've waited long enough. A schoolteacher's position still awaits you in my town, and my home needs a woman's touch. Your family would approve of this match." Eveline nodded silently, knowing he spoke the truth. This had been her intended path before the train's mistake delivered her to the wrong station months ago. The logical choice seemed clear, yet her heart felt anchored to the weathered boards of the McGraw ranch. Jonas had disappeared into the barn after dinner, his face unreadable as always. His silence on the matter spoke volumes. He would not ask her to stay, would not admit what they both felt. growing between them. "I'll have your answer in the morning," she finally replied, watching as her suitor climbed into his wagon and departed. Later, as Eveline packed her few belongings in the fading lamplight, the bedroom door creaked open. Abigail stood there, her nightgown billowing around her small frame, eyes red-rimmed from crying. "You're leaving us," the child accused, her voice breaking. "Abigail, Eveline began, but the words caught in her throat. "You don't understand." Abigail rushed forward, grabbing Eveline's hands. "I prayed for you. Every night after Mama died, I asked God to send someone to love Papa and me." Eveline felt her heart constrict. "Abigail, these things aren't so simple." "I prayed for you," Abigail repeated, tears streaming down her face. "Don't let prayers be wasted." The raw honesty in the child's voice struck Eveline like a physical blow. She sank onto the bed, pulling Abigail close. "The train wasn't supposed to stop here," Eveline whispered. "It was a mistake." "No," Abigail said with the unwavering certainty of childhood. "It wasn't a mistake. It was an answer." Something shifted inside Eveline then, a realization that perhaps her presence here wasn't mere happenstance, but something more profound. The teaching materials in her trunk, her skills with horses, even her growing affection for Jonas. All of it suddenly seemed part of a larger design. She thought of Jonas working silently in the barn, of the ranch that now felt more like home than anywhere she'd ever been, and of this child who had prayed her into existence. "Perhaps you're right," Eveline whispered, wiping away Abigail's tears. "Perhaps some mistakes are actually answers in disguise." The saloon buzzed with conversation and laughter, the amber glow of oil lamps casting long shadows across weathered faces. Jonas McGraw sat stiffly at a corner table, nursing a glass of whiskey while the townsfolk celebrated the successful cattle auction. The fiddle's mournful tune seemed to echo his own inner turmoil as he watched Eveline Carter across the room, engaged in animated conversation with the schoolteacher. For 3 years, he had maintained his silence about matters of the heart. 3 years of nodding politely when neighbors offered condolences or suggested eligible women from neighboring towns. 3 years of retreating behind the walls of his ranch, speaking only when business demanded it. But tonight was different. The rival suitor had arrived earlier, standing too close to Eveline, his intentions clear to everyone present. Jonas felt something crack inside him when he saw Abigail's fearful eyes dart between the stranger and her father. The rancher drained his glass and stood, his chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor. The sound rippled through the room, conversations faltering as heads turned toward him. Jonas cleared his throat, unused to being the center of attention. "I have something to say," he announced, his voice rough but carrying clearly across the suddenly hushed saloon. "Miss Carter came to us by accident of the railway, but there are no accidents in this life." His hands trembled slightly, but his gaze remained steady as he continued. "My daughter believes Eveline was heaven-sent, and I've come to believe she's right. That woman has earned her place at our table and in our lives." Eveline's eyes widened, her cheeks flushing as the rancher's words hung in the air. "I know what you all whisper about," Jonas continued, addressing the stunned faces around him. "But I don't care anymore. Eveline is family to us now, however she came to be here." The schoolteacher squeezed Eveline's hand supportively while murmurs rippled through the crowd. The rival suitor's face darkened as he pushed his way toward the door. Jonas met Eveline's gaze across the room, a silent question in his eyes. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, tears glistening. The fiddle player, sensing the moment, struck up a livelier tune. Slowly, conversations resumed, though many glances still flicked between Jonas and Eveline. The loyal ranch hand who had warned Eveline against hoping for Jonas's heart raised his glass in reluctant acknowledgement. The preacher, standing near the bar, smiled knowingly. Abigail's letter had borne fruit after all. For Jonas, the weight of years of silence lifted from his shoulders. For Eveline, the declaration was more precious than any formal proposal. And for the people of the small Kansas town, the night would be remembered as the evening when Jonas McGraw finally spoke his heart. Eveline Carter stood at the edge of the McGraw property, the letter from her family clutched in her hand. The eastern wind carried whispers of the life she was leaving behind, a teaching position at a respectable school, her parents' approval, the security of familiar surroundings. With each passing day, those whispers grew fainter, replaced by the sounds of cattle lowing and prairie grass rustling. "I can't go back," she whispered to herself. watching as Jonas rode in from checking the southern fence line. The rancher dismounted with practiced ease, his eyes finding hers across the yard. Something had changed between them, something neither could name, but both could feel. The decision to stay hadn't come without cost. Her family's last letter made their disappointment clear. They couldn't understand how their educated daughter could choose a hardscrabble existence on the Kansas prairie over the life they'd planned. The words stung, but not as deeply as the thought of leaving this place, this family behind. Jonas faced his own sacrifices. The prairie fire had claimed nearly 40 acres of prime grazing land. Though he'd saved the herd, the loss meant tighter margins this year. He'd have to sell some cattle earlier than planned. The whispers in town hadn't stopped either. Some still questioned his judgment in keeping a woman who'd arrived by mistake, calling him desperate or worse. "Papa says we're going to town tomorrow," Abigail announced, skipping toward Eveline. The girl's prayers for a new mother had been answered, but even she was learning that answered prayers came with responsibilities. She helped more with chores now, determined to prove herself worthy of the family she'd prayed into existence. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the scarred landscape in gold and purple, Jonas spoke quietly. "Land grows back." "So do reputations." Eveline nodded, understanding the unspoken message. What mattered wasn't what they'd lost, but what they'd found. The loyal ranch hand, who had once tried to undermine her, now tipped his hat when they passed. The schoolteacher had become an ally, and even the preacher nodded approvingly when they attended Sunday service. "I never thought belonging would cost so much," Eveline admitted, "but I never imagined it would give so much either." Jonas reached across the space between them, his calloused hand finding hers. "Nothing worth having comes without a price." From inside they heard Abigail humming as she set the table for supper. The McGraw ranch stood as it always had, weathered, imperfect, but enduring. Like the family it sheltered, it bore its scars proudly, proof that survival wasn't just about avoiding damage but about healing afterward. The prairie came alive with a tapestry of wildflowers, painting the once-scorched earth with vibrant hues of purple, yellow, and blue. Eveline Carter stood on the porch of the McGraw ranch house, watching the sunrise cast golden light across the land that had become her home. A year ago, she had stepped off that train at the wrong station, clutching her trunk of teaching materials, uncertain of her future. Now, as spring breathed new life into the Kansas landscape, she understood that mistakes sometimes led to the most precious destinations. Jonas McGraw emerged from the barn, his weathered face softening as he caught sight of Eveline. The rancher who had once guarded his heart behind walls of grief now moved with a lightness that surprised even him. He joined her on the porch, their shoulders nearly touching as they surveyed the land together. "The railroad men will be back next week," he said quietly. "They're still wanting that south parcel." Eveline nodded, remembering how the threat of progress had once divided them. "We'll face them together," she replied, her voice steady with the confidence that had grown throughout their shared hardships. Inside the house, Abigail hummed as she set the table for breakfast. The child who had prayed so fervently for a mother now moved between them with the easy certainty of answered prayers. Her faith had never wavered, even when the adults around her struggled with doubt. "The burn marks are fading," Jonas observed, gesturing toward the distant field where the prairie fire had raged months before. "New grass is stronger there." "Like us," Eveline said softly. They had weathered so much: illness, jealousy, the rival suitors' claims, the townspeople's suspicions. The ranch hand who had once sabotaged their equipment now worked alongside them with grudging respect. The schoolteacher continued to praise Eveline's reading lessons, which had expanded to include children from 3 neighboring homesteads. Abigail burst through the door, her braids bouncing. "Papa!" "Miss Eveline, come see what I found in the garden." Jonas reached for Eveline's hand, an action that once would have seemed impossible. The widower who had believed that solitude was his only protection now understood that true strength came from opening his heart, not barricading it. "I never thought I'd be grateful for a train stopping at the wrong station," he murmured. Eveline squeezed his hand. Some mistakes aren't mistakes at all. As they followed Abigail too, the garden, the morning sun, illuminated their path. The future held no guarantees. The railroad still threatened. Memories of loss would never completely fade, and the challenges of frontier life remained. But hope had taken root in the McGraw ranch, as persistent and resilient as the prairie grass itself. Together they had become a family not of chance or convenience, but of choice and love. proof that sometimes the wrong station led to exactly the right destination.